And we're on. This is Daniel Casmir, and he has a channel on YouTube, also called Daniel Casmir, right?
What do you know?
And just keep it original, like the Norm Macdonald show with Guess Who. And he defines his channel topic as being against the left, and we're talking today about a number of topics that are cropping up more and more often. Um, Obviously, we've been having a real split in the country that, to be honest with you, I thought was going to sort of dissipate after the election, like it usually does. I remember in 2008, it did get pretty contentious, but um, eventually people kind of went back to their regular lives and their phony baloney jobs or whatever it is, and that's the way my attitude was developed about 8 years ago. During the election season, I've kind of become probably in the past 15 years more towards the free market side of the spectrum, but I've never been politically active. And I could probably assume that you're seeing the same thing, where regular people they're just getting more and more animated about
Well,
public affairs.
that's exactly what I was going to ask was if you had been politically active in the prior elections, and you say you haven't, and so the political activity on your end is more recent, and so that mirrors mine. And just pointing out that it's kind of interesting that we would have both assumed that the activity in general would have died down after the election of us maintained that kind of after the elections. So we expected something other than what we're doing. And so it's this kind of thing that I think is happening to a lot of people. In fact, I think it's just this energy that is surrounding things that is creating a unusual, has just maintained this fervor in the culture. So interesting point to start with.
And what really came out of the woodwork during the last election, even more, and it never totally dies down, is racial identity politics. And I could probably say, and I've shared material with you. I've seen some of your material. Racial identity means something different for a lot of people. I know a lot of people, for example, that they're, in the area I live in, there's a lot of Slovenians and Croatians, and they're very, they have a great cohesive community centered around Croatian culture. And I'm a Jewish person, and I used to have a lot of Croatian friends at the college I went to. And even though there's like a bitter history between us, it was pretty amazing to see like these people. They're living in the same county, they have the same banks, they have the same churches, the same clubs, and whatever. And I was noticing I've seen a couple other people who are talking about white nationalism. I saw a couple people, and including you. And I'm noticing that for many Americans that have been here, their families have been here for several generations, they're lacking that identity, especially white Americans. Coming from a household that is, let's say, German, Irish, or whatever, and that's really what
Absolutely.
I'm seeing. Um, and a lot of people in the Jewish community are nervous about white nationalism, but they're not understanding that people have been deprived of any. Excuse me. I do have a cough, by the way. I should warn you. So if it
Oh,
gets
I am aware. No worries at all.
yeah. So anyway, we always are proud about having like strong institutions in the Jewish community. And maybe could you describe growing up in a home where I don't know if
Yes.
you lived in a single parent house like I did, but how was it to kind of swim through that dark water where you didn't really have anything to hold on to, if that's what you think?
Yeah. So that's a great place to start. I've actually done a video that kind of touches on this too. I grew up and I was so saturated with the leftist dogma, such a lack of awareness about what that dogma actually was. And I really internalized a kind of self-hate of my identity. And through my teenage years, up until I was about 15, I really exemplified the type of person who wants to be exactly as far away as they can get from being a white male that is successful. So suit and tie equals asshole, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was raised in a progressive or liberal environment, and so I've lived with black families. I've lived in the hood, you know, and I don't live in a huge city, so it's not projects, but I've lived in the hood. I've lived with black families. I've my best friends since third grade have been black, and so this is the kind of environment that I grew up in. And since I was 15, I had a really big change, and I don't want to go into it. Had to do with psychedelics. It's this crazy experience. I'll go into it at some other time. You can check out my channel for a video on that later down the road. But drastic transition, and then throughout the last 6 years of my life, up until 21, I'm 24 now, I had all of these strings that were attached from this period of time, and I didn't know why I couldn't get over these depressions and bouts of just catatonic, states and abuse of substances. And I eventually, after a lot of self-knowledge work and trying to pinpoint the things in my life that might have caused me to be so broken, I started to develop a political awareness and started to develop of what had just commandeered my essence, in terms of my cognitive real estate. And that was the leftist ideology, and a kind of unique perception when it comes to my evaluation of the identitarian politics on the other side of the equation. I really instilled in me the kind of anti-racist qualities of the left. I ethnicities, different types of people as very different now, but I also see an inalienable value in the human being, and I attempt to transcend this dialectic of white people can't be self-identifying as white people, but everybody else can, and then on the other side of the coin, I identify as a white person, so then I exclude every other ethnicity, and don't give them value, and you can transcend this dialectic, I think, by thinking about things as having two different families on a street, and each family, for their self-interest, has to have a special relationship with the people in their own family. But for the interest of the entire block, every family has a decent relationship with every other family. And so it's not even required that you make the appeal to emotion and the appeal to leftist ideas of, you're making me feel bad, and so that's not a good thing. You can really make just a pragmatic argument about what is really best for the world in this age of globalization, where we can blow the planet up in 10 seconds, Like we have to figure out how to transcend that dialectic, and identity is key in this election process, and down the road until today, we can see that is a crucial entire cultural fervor. We need to figure out a way to transcend this really vicious dialectic, and so that's the way I'm trying to approach the identity.
So let me jump back in there for a second. So what you're talking about, I've seen. I actually, as a kid, I'd read a lot. I was kind of like a library bookworm because I'd cut school so much. So I used to read a lot about the neo-Nazi movement in America, and that's kind of the image that we get. We get this this tattooed guy, usually with a shaved head, maybe a goatee, has been to prison for San Quentin or whatever, and it's largely because of but people don't talk about why that motif even was created. But what you're talking about is actually a result of I read about in some of those books. They weren't exactly academic texts, but they were broad outlines of the neo-Nazi movement, and they would interview recruiters, and they would say some things that are along the lines of what you're saying, which is, briefly, they would go to usually a high school, and they would talk to the white kids, and they'd say, look, the Latino kids have a group that they go to, and they can celebrate their culture. Let's say in California, it would be Central American or Mexican. Then you would have, obviously, the black groups. There aren't so much an issue with Koreans and other Asian groups, but they tend to gather together. People tend to sit together. And what they would do is they'd say, hey, those guys have groups for themselves. You need a group for you. And this is the unseen truth that is, it belies the whole myth about these people being degenerate criminals to begin with. These are people, they were raised in the era of multiculturalism. And what multiculturalism has failed to do is to explain to people that even if they're not in one of these discriminated minority groups, let's call them, that their own culture has a value. That if your name is, let's say, Seamus McDonald, and you have Irish heritage or whatever, that you have a rich history to sit back on, and it's not always within the confines of white nationalism, which is something that confuses me, because white nationalism is a weird thing. We don't, and it's the same problem with black nationalism. It's something I didn't get to go into with my other guest the previous time, but you're talking about Africa being a continent, numerous different people there.
So I think I can quickly give maybe a thought on that. Black Lives Matter identifying person would say is that because of the African history in America, the socialized of that demographic is black, right? So it is really the only way to deal with that grouping. And so I think in these, you just touched on everything that I'm wrestling with. Like, I appreciate that a lot. Because well, we can get into that, but I would kind of say that one of the problems, and I would say that it is in a lot of ways that we are at the place that we are, and that'll be integrated into the answers to what you were talking about prior. But what's happened with the postmodernist movement within a neo-Marxist framework, and postmodernism is about deconstructing things and eliminating the variety or classification of something being more valuable than something else, and it's nested within Marxism because that is the simplest value structure. It's
Bingo.
1, 2, oppressor, oppressed. Yeah. So that's why that is, but in that system, socialized into a conglomerate, and we have kind of, obviously to a much less acute degree, been stripped of the individualized, more individualized identity types to a large degree, and B, context are only identifiable as white. And so I think that's something that I'm wrestling with, but is tentatively right now.
Well, I think like that's really, you're kind of following that exact arc that I was reading about. And this was in 1996 I was reading about this. And it had been a result of the progressive movements of the 60s, second wave feminism,
yes.
The Black Power movement, the Chicano movement, and all that. And just like I could totally understand somebody Mexican American. I don't care what they do if they're in if they were into soccer or whatever culture, obviously our music. I like all types of music, but what happened, and it was described very perfectly, was that there was a counterpunch, a backlash that happened among some, especially the poorer white children, and they were saying, where's our club? Where's our opportunity to, really show our heritage? And that's something that
I think that might be a deviating point.
Mhm.
I think that the reason why there are parallels necessarily is that some things are necessarily derived just through logical extrapolation. And the issue, I think, when you get into unhealthy movements, you have a situation where there is a certain degree of logical extrapolation that is congruent with you would reason yourself. And then where this is what I'm really trying to get at in my own mind. So I can really answer things definitively for you, but I think it's useful to go over these thought processes for me and you. I see I would wonder. I would ask you so we can get a little bit more of the text that you read.
Yeah.
What was in terms of the dialectic idea, and how does that factor into the direction of the text?
Which text are you referring
to? Whichever ones you're referencing, the ones that you're
okay.
drawing.
What happened is that, and I don't see it as really, it wasn't an academic study, but they were observing there was a militia movement that mushroomed in the 90s due to the Bill Clinton assault rifle policy. Yeah. And along with that, the way economics was working, a lot of these Rust Belt towns, a lot of towns in Inland Empire, California, the white working class people were left behind, and you had this liberal upper crust, the white upper crust, that was they were telling these people, hey, look, you have to be tolerant of these people who don't look like you, who came from another country possibly. And that includes, by the way, refugees from Vietnam. And these people were saying, wait a second, fine, you want me to respect their heritage, but you don't want anybody to respect my heritage. And it happened, it wasn't just even only a white identity issue that was happening in, as is portrayed, in American History X, in the prison system or in gangs or whatever. Remember, in the 70s, where was the biggest racial confrontation? It wasn't in the South, which is always blamed for all of our racial problems. It wasn't in, it wasn't in the military. It was in Boston at the school integrations, the busing. And what was happening there was that in order to bring together this policy where we would have forced integration of schools, even if it wasn't convenient for the parents or the people of the neighborhood, the poor people were being forced to have their kids bused across town to black schools. And likewise, the black parents, by the way, also often they were like, why do I have to have my kids bused across town? I had a radical professor at my college who said, and this was in Cleveland, he said that he hated it too, because his kids could have gone to a school probably 3 blocks from where he lived, and they were going all the way across town. And this guy was not, I mean, he was a black nationalist, I can tell you. Also, he was a Fidel Castro fan, and he said it was a horrible policy too. And what happened was that people started to process that a person who is comfortable, a person who's gotten the financial security already, it's very easy for them to tell the poor to tolerate the other person, to accept them into their schools and whatever, when they can move over to a different neighborhood. They can move to a different school district and send their kids to a Catholic school or a private, stuffed shirt school. And that was the genesis. In Boston, it was Irish identity in some neighborhoods, Italian identity in some neighborhoods. In California and other parts of the country, it did become an issue where these notorious skinhead gangs that everybody's talking about, they were able to recruit a lot of people due to policies that could have been avoided entirely. So I don't think it was really it was really a cause and effect phenomenon.
Yeah.
And what are you supposed to say to somebody whose parents want them to have a better education, and they're basically being used as a guinea pig for some social engineering?
You just broke up a little bit. Can you repeat the last 5 words?
I was saying
Can you
that.
repeat the last 5 words? You broke up a little bit.
Yeah, I saw that too.
Something about social engineering.
Yeah, there's very little you can say to condemn people for being mad about having their kids used for social engineering, for some sort of racial integration experiment.
Yes.
That's not really, it's not really to bring up the academics of the school or better the welfare of the kid or enrich their environment. That's basically
Absolutely.
what I saw.
So one thing I've been thinking about a little bit is the idea of freedom of association. I think that we can make. Okay, so let me back up a little bit, because I think it's necessary to frame why this issue in general is important. I'm doing a lot of work with Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. I'm reading the documents and et cetera. And I did the UN replacement migration plan. And so this is talking about the Europe or America being so low that the population is being halved every generation, which means that if you extrapolate generationally out to 2300 and you start at 300 million, you get every 15 years, we have let's just say a 250-year period, right? Let's put in 10 generations for 15 years to just shorten it up a little bit. Meet it closely. And you get 300 million, 150 million, 75 million, 40 million, 10 million. And that's 8. So there's a really serious issue, and I don't see the issue as an issue of my people, right? That's not how I see it. I see the issue as a strategy to secure a full spectrum dominance over the developed world. If we look at the world and we look at the cultures that are being imported into the United States and Europe in order to replace the declining birth rates, and the goal is to keep the population at an even keel. You can see that their cultures have had no history in any kind of humanitarian processes. There's no development of philosophy, no development of Enlightenment ethics, of ethics that birth the concepts of agency of the individual or individual responsibility. And we know that a country cannot have a democracy with an IQ on average below 90. So I see then the idea of whiteness, I see it as a really malicious component of the cultural Marxist agenda. That cultural Marxist, that because of its really tied to the cultural Marxist agenda, the cultural Marxist agenda cannot be solved without this being addressed in some way. And I think that there will be
one small remark. Basically, what you're saying, and I'll let you get right back to this. You're saying that they're basically importing docile people that are easier to manipulate.
Yeah, if you You could phrase it that way if you chose to. You can look at IQ statistics. The Hispanic population that's being imported is IQ average 87. That's kind of similar to the Islamic population, the Middle Eastern population. And we know that there's you can also look at the map of the world and look at where democracies and individualist and human rights respecting methodologies have developed, and
Yeah.
you will see an issue. And we can look at the demographic voting populations for the left, and we can look at it versus for the right, and we can see clear, at least short-term incentives that may not be, you might not be able to implicate any given politician with some long-term agenda, but we do have these articulated plans of Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 and the UN Replacement Migration Plan of 1995 to 2050. So we know that this is going on, and whether or not there is a motive behind it, I think that the conspiracy is irrelevant. We are already seeing the effects. We're going to see much more drastic effects. There's also a Robert Putnam study in 2001. He's a Harvard professor. He held on to the study for 5 years. And he was trying to disprove it, and he couldn't. And it talked about how the cultural cohesion, the social cohesion, is upped by a very large margin, and trust and productivity as well. And so that I don't see it. I'm taking that families living on the street block notion where I'm coming from, and coming from that place, I look at this situation, and that is like immovable objects staring us in the face, and there's a chance that no matter what we do, there will be an unstoppable force and an immovable object. But I'm trying to parse out. There needs to be a change in trajectory. I don't know if there is another in trajectory that is has the potential to resolve the issue, because it fundamentally has to do with a population being displaced, and I think that that's a lot to do gymnastics around to navigate around, and
What
say
you
we need to all put things aside, and that component of it, right? We need to have that kind of foundation in our understanding of how we relate to each other, but I don't think that is an intelligent way to solve the problem. That's kind of a passion is the highest value kind of thing, highest moral value, or the road to hell is paved with good intentions kind of thing, and any path.
So what you're touching on, I remember I was thinking about it a few weeks ago, and it already feels like 5 months ago, the Manchester bombing. It was an
Yeah.
issue that I've been observing. I went to a college where we have a massive community of Saudi Arabians and other Arab. They're not immigrants, but they're exchange students. And the metaphor I came up with, and I'm a mechanical engineer, so it kind of jibes with my some of the things that I've learned.
Oh, wow, nice.
So it's a relief valve. Whenever you have a hydraulic circuit and the pressure builds up too much, you have a relief valve. It discharges whatever fluid is in the circuit, so that it won't have obviously a leak or a breach of some sort. So what I put together a small video about it. Most of my videos are long.
I'll have to go back and check that one out. I think that's an interesting topic.
So what's been happening, and in Saudi Arabia they do it on a temporary basis, but listen how the strategy works.
Yeah.
And it is a strategy on the part of those governments, and partially on the part of our government and Canada, for example. You have countries in the Middle East, and if you don't know already, if you haven't seen my videos, I did serve in the army over in Israel, and there is an issue where you have millions and millions of kids that are growing up. They don't have a real, like, to use your word, a trajectory in life to really get anywhere. The regimes that are in those countries will only let you go so far, and you have to grease the skids in order to get there. So what happens when these people get angry? They start to foment riots. You saw that in 2011 in Egypt, which, by the way, Egypt is probably one of the more, I can't say too much about how nice the Egyptian people I know are, but it's a country fraught with danger because you have millions and millions of kids, and realistically, it's very hard to get to the top in Egypt. And we're not talking, I mean, political office is a great example. You have to be affiliated with the army in order to get there. Corporations, it's so what do? They'll have their kids go, in the case of Saudi Arabia, for 4 years. They'll blow off steam in the United States, screw a bunch of hookers, and basically get all of their youthful angst out of their system. Then they'll go back to Saudi Arabia and be good Wahhabi practitioners.
Have that guilt of a law looking down on them after partying for 4 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's actually not as bad as the other countries, the more dysfunctional countries like Nigeria and now Syria, not Nigeria, Algeria, Syria, and Iraq. All these war-torn countries, or countries with totalitarian regimes that are in a certain way. So wait, let me just finish.
I definitely see what you're talking about. I don't know if what I'm about to say changes the makeup of the idea to a relevant degree, but we look at Project for a New American Century, written by Prescott or H. Bush, and some other cohorts, and then implemented in the year 2000 by George W. Bush. Actually, in the document, it says we need a new Pearl Harbor, and the year George Bush comes into office, we have a new Pearl Harbor, and the document outlines the regime change in 7 Middle Eastern nations, and none of those nations are Saudi Arabia. One of them is Egypt, one of them is Libya, one of them is Syria, one of them is Iran, and so this is really seems to be kind of the process the outline that we're following in the Middle East, and so the degree to which there is interconnective between the United States and Saudi Arabia, I think, could also act as a kind of I don't know how it would be within the mechanical engineering field, but there might be another kind of release that is this slow and steady kind of release of good relations.
That's what the relief valve in this context, which is worse than the Saudi relief valve. The Saudi relief valve is only like a little steam. What you get with, let's say, the Syrian relief valve is a country that, first of all, it's ruled by, a minority tyrant, and he's putting down the majority of his population. So if there's tons of young people that are angry, what does he care if they leave and go to a country like France and just cause mayhem there? I mean, it's no skin off of his back, and it's and you can't blame him. It's the same paradigm that Castro used in the 70s. He released all these political prisoners to the United States.
Turkey and the European Union, right?
Absolutely,
now. I mean, that's another good example. Absolutely. Sorry.
So we're seeing this, and I think Mexico does it too, and so do these all these. If you haven't heard it in the news, it's getting more and more prominent. I know people living here from Honduras that they're very concerned about it. There's a gang called MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, which they're coming.
I have a couple of personal stories about that.
Oh well,
we'll talk about it sometime.
Well, yeah, we'll see. Well, we're getting. You see, the more emails and whatever we're exchanging, the more topics are coming up. So we're gonna have to do.
Just blooming flowers everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, you put in a Mao reference right there. That's great. the hundred blooming flowers. So anyway, that's really the America is, and that's why Donald Trump, I think he hit on a major nerve that I wasn't really aware of, that people are tired of us being the receptacle for that steam that's getting released from the rest of the world.
Well, so is there, I mean, it's kind of like as that relief fluid seeps into these other containers, as the containers are filling up, so there's another relief valve that needs to open, to like a kind of thing. I don't know.
Trump isn't building.
Kind of what you're saying.
Trump isn't just building a wall. He's installing some valves. That's a way. But
well, yeah. I mean, I don't. I just. I mean, do you think that? I don't know. You take this to its next spot. No, we'll...
Okay, so what I envision here is the alternative. You're talking about, is there a different trajectory to take? I started following Europe, not really European, British politics, because Britain is now leaving the European Union, but at the time it was British politics with the EU. And Nigel Farage, I think this was around 2007, I started hearing his name a little more. And he was trying to say, look, we're the British people, and we're not going to just abandon our interests and then expand on that our identity in order to accommodate all these rules that are for a supranational body that act in the interests of an elite. So, that ties in with immigration, and obviously today more than ever, what he's basically saying, and that's why I see him as one of probably the 2 or 3 favorite public figures that I have today. And I don't believe in just trusting everybody implicitly, or trusting his word as gospel, or Rand Paul's word as gospel.
Yeah,
but what he's saying is this, okay? We're talking about sovereignty, we're talking about direct democracy. And if we allow these countries to use us as their relief valve, there is literally no hope of them ever really developing into and becoming high IQ countries, let's say. And I talk to people from people from Morocco. I see them there. One of them posted it, and I'll maybe one day I'll send you a screenshot. He said this: we want the King of Morocco to send to our region jobs, education, and infrastructure. He lives in the Rif, which is a neglected part of Morocco. And basically what he's saying is, we want our leaders to do the things that in a state like, let's say Italy or here, we take for granted, which is that our leaders will look for the interests of the average person, their constituents, not their peasant subjects. And that's exactly what he is. He's a peasant subject. But Morocco is a monarchy. But basically, Mr. Farage, who is just demonized by the media, and like a lot of people is called a racist and an anti-Semite, even though it's all those things are to the contrary of his real. He has an agenda that is more towards liberty and direct democracy, which has nothing to do with those ideas. He's saying this, okay? If we recognize the differences between each country, and we have reasonable trade, and if there's merit-based immigration, if let's say there's radiologists that are needed and they're from India, why should they be bumped behind in the queue in favor of people from Romania that are basically going to work as day laborers? And that's just within Europe.
Yeah.
So what he's saying is this: if we can't, and I don't think he says this all the time, but we have to hold our neighbors and the other countries around the world to the same standards as we hold our leaders. And that's
It's
Go ahead.
incredible. Like if we can take this family analogy and really put upon this situation in a ton of ways, we have these dynamics of codependency and abuse. And that's something that I think might a I've been using that analogy because I think that it is a good way of kind of putting some droplets in the water and the mud goes away. You know, this is such a convoluted because the situation is just so complex. If we look at a principle like codependence, rather than trying to analyze the individualities of the scenario, we get this clearer picture, and then we can see and evaluate that. But the idea is relationship. For instance, the reason I think I might be wrong about this, but well, we can just talk about Islam. I was going to talk about Ashkenazi Jews and their supremely high IQ, linguistic intelligence particularly, and this just thought that it had to do with a very close intermarriage, or I don't know, but keeping a eugenic process where the mating value is in something that then something likely to be even stronger for their environment to proceed. And so we look at Islam and Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, and we see the exact opposite, like a really high percentage of cousin marriages and stuff. And that's just really dysgenic. And I know those terms are just so dirty, and I don't mean them in any kind of way other than the idea of nature complex and stronger, or nature becoming less complex and less stable. That's what I mean. And the codependent relationship is really just that kind of dysgenic relationship, and it's I think that we have. I think it's a tragedy.
So you
And
touched on you can keep going if you want, or
no, I think I just mean to agree with you about what you're talking about, Farash saying. I think that is I think an interesting way to think about it is codependence and abusive relationships. And you can look at the various pathologies that drive the leftist ideology, and you can see how that being the dominant narrative that has been driving policy decisions, whether it's not from the plebeian level or from the level, manipulating the plebs, but that general postmodernist trend has been driving culture, and you can see how those codependent relationships or abusive relationships develop out of that, because they themselves profess no value in the family structure or a strong unit or anything like that. So there's just consistency there, and I
yeah, that's it's funny that you do mention the Ashkenaz IQ issue, which I've heard people talk about before. I am half Ashkenaz and half it's called in Hebrew Mizrahi, which is
okay.
that's Babylonian Jewry. So well, broadly speaking, it's called just Babylonian Jewry. So we were from Baghdad. We lived there for like 2,000 years, and in the 50s they were kicked out of Baghdad, which is a different topic. Maybe I've been seeing a few more people getting interested in it. But the Ashkenaz IQ thing has kind of been a joke in my mind, and you're probably taking it from real statistics and real studies, so I'm not disputing any of it. But what I find hilarious is that you see people that they're from like the same, they're from that background, and they're always talking about, oh, we have all these Nobel Prize winners, and we have all these these jazz musicians, for example. And I happen to know, even though I'm not very musically talented, that jazz is one of the hardest styles to master.
Yeah,
But
I'm a,
yeah, I think you told me that you dabble in a lot of music, or you've had a music career.
all of the music that you've heard on my channel is improvisations that I've done.
Oh, okay. So you know exactly what I mean. So that
Absolutely.
they'll have this pride in that,
100%.
and they'll be bagging groceries or something, or they'll have, or I have a friend, and it's I'm not happy to talk about it because I've seen this is a person, he has bipolar disorder and whatever, and he always talks about exactly what you're saying, and he comes from a full Ashkenaz background, and his life has unraveled because of a mental illness. So basically, my attitude towards that is things like that, the high IQ and this potential can be blown very easily. It can be it can be squandered very easily. So it's well, actually
definitely finish.
So the problem that I've been seeing, and if you've read any of the written material I sent you, we're seeing right now.
I started looking at your blog. I've read through the top layers of your blog.
So yeah, that issue you're talking about, we started this conversation about white identity, about black identity. There's also a problem when you take an identity that is supposed to be about topics that are beyond race and make it about race and make it about things that are really not necessarily contained within biology. I'm not a mega spiritual person. I'd say that I could improve a lot in terms of my knowledge and practice of Judaism, my religion. But if you read about our heritage in the Bible, it contains warnings, and those warnings are that if we take the gifts that were entrusted with us and we squander them and don't fulfill our obligations, then they can be taken away from us, and they are taken away from us. And that's why we see suffering among generations of people that let's say the Crusades, there was the Holocaust and things like that, and people who are living in modern America, we're benefiting right now as a religious community, which I insist on sticking to, from one of the best conditions that's ever been given to us. There is no door that's closed to us. We can talk to people. We don't have to pretend that we're, I don't have to change my name. I probably would, because it's, there's 80 million people that have the same name, and I get confused with people. But the issues that we suffered from in other countries are, miles away from what we're benefiting from today. And yet, Dan, and I'm sorry if I'm going off on a tangent.
No, it's okay.
You have idiots, morons like Sarah Silverman and
yes.
and the head of the ADL, and they are appropriating heritage that is religious. By the way, it's based on
the most. Keep going. Yeah.
So yeah, we're having an issue where people we're having an entire identity politicized, and it's not just the Jewish community; it is the Black community, and they should be rebelling against it with all their worth. They should. The time has come, in my opinion, for people to stop depending on organizations to represent their opinions, and to start, really exploring their opinions. Which, I think, absolutely, watching your channel, I think that's what your channel is about. That's what a lot of these people. There's another guy I was communicating with him today, and I'm not going to mention his name because I want to set up something and I don't have a commitment, but he's also doing the same thing. He said since last year he's exploring a lot of the issues with the agenda being presented to the Black community. And, it's time for, in my opinion, the same process to begin in my own community, which is, I continue to say it's a religious community. If you see the post, and I'll put it in the description for this video too, and I'll put your channel in the description too. There's people that are trying to turn every single issue into a racial issue and every single community into a racial community. And in fact, yesterday I saw somebody, Anna Kasparian, that idiot from TYT, say that Donald Trump apparently had a racial power advantage over James Comey, and it's ridiculous. And I think
Dude, they are so off the wall. It is insane.
I'm gonna
You know
pass.
who does like really, really good breakdowns of the TYT videos is Atheism is Unstoppable. He's pretty coarse, but if you just want to watch somebody bang on them, it's can be pretty funny.
Yeah, there's a guy, Hard Bastard is pretty funny.
Yeah.
There's a guy named V from Romania who is a master.
No, dude, I was watching V's. Did you see the Superwoman video today?
Yeah. Oh, I didn't see that yet.
Dude.
I was doing a lot of shit at work, so I was super.
You gotta watch it.
Don't ruin it for me. I'll go watch it myself.
It's exactly what's being talked about, and she's even really contriving it in a almost more outrageous way, in the sense that, well, not more outrageous, because your outrageous context is conflating religion and race, and her outrageous context is talking about India and Pakistan, and then early naturally the Islamic religion and its relationship with India and stuff. You'll see it's really contemptuous. That's the thing that I am worried about most from all sides of the playing field, is contempt and resentment. That's I think the anyway. But
so you brought up. Go ahead. I think I passed the ball to you.
Okay. Yeah. So Sarah Silverman. With the IQ thing, I think that you're right, that overvaluing. I had my IQ tested when I was young. I don't know how I feel about posting a video on this on my channel, because I feel like it's a little bit knowing
I've never done it. I don't know why. I've never had the curiosity.
You don't need to at this point.
Go ahead.
You don't need to at this point. I didn't. It wasn't a curiosity thing. It was that I was one of those kids that they wanted to put on ADD meds. And so they had to make sure I wasn't stupid first. And but it's also correlated. It's related to the mental illness thing, right? Like I was not put myself together, and no matter how high the IQ is, it can be entirely dismantled just because you insert one other factor, right? And so it is important to contextualize it. The reason why I bring it up is because it is a good measuring tool within the context of Western civilization, just in general, and what you need in order to succeed at varying levels of degrees in Western civilization. It's a very strong correlation with income, very strong correlation with position, things like that. Very strong correlation with lower crime. So that's the degree of importance that I think it deserves being endowed with the weight of.
Okay. I mean, I think like what you're saying is, and I've heard of I don't remember what his name was, but there was a professor that was can you still hear me, by the way?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. So there's a professor, I think a number of years ago, that was promoting a lot of these issues as things to watch for, and he was pretty much stigmatized and made a pariah.
Rushton.
Is it Rushton? And I think what we're seeing a huge problem here, which has to do with cultural Marxism and social justice warriors, where you want to bring up a problem, and it goes through every single, whether it's sports or music now, and fashion, with the way people wear their hair, where you want to bring up an issue that you have, or an issue of your personal taste. Suddenly they're calling you some sort of bigot. And this is something I noticed, and bringing it back to my own experience, and you might remember there was a little movie called Passion of the Christ, and it was.
I think I watched it.
Yeah, so
I'm not sure.
I don't think I watched the whole thing, but you know, it was.
Slipped my mind.
I just remember it was just kind of. I remember the production was kind of impressive.
The only thing I remember is like a really, really, really rich type of production value at some moment. That's all I remember. I don't even know how to explain it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, but being within my community, obviously watching it from the inside,
Yeah.
there was this hysteria going on, and it was bizarre because I'd grown up. I loved the Lethal Weapon movies. Mel Gibson had a number of other movies that were less successful that I liked, but people started saying, you know, Mel Gibson is a menace. He's going to we're going to be called Christ killers again, and you know, for a few years I was like just, you know, apathetic about it. I never watched the movie. And then I started to realize that, you know what is the bigger threat? And you know, you don't have to answer the question because it's kind of a rhetorical one. What's the bigger threat to us as a community? Is it a Hollywood actor producing a movie about his own religion and the way that he perceives it according to classic Catholic beliefs, or is it this massive system of cultural Marxism in our colleges that is gradually demonizing group after group after group and turning them into basically targets, like in some sort of Stalinist purge? And you know,
Okay. Yeah.
I kind of learned. What do I care what Mel Gibson does? Even if he's ranting while drunk, getting stopped by a cop, he hasn't. There's nothing that he's done that really rises to some sort of crime that beyond drunk driving that I can really be pissed off about. I mean, obviously he
So
doesn't like me.
okay. Yeah. So okay. Here. So that actually, what I'm about to say relates well to exactly what you ended with. What he was saying doesn't rise to the of a crime or what's going on with the cultural Marxist stuff. And that is not to say that if you extrapolate what he's saying to its end, that doesn't rise above. Like that's not what I'm talking about. The point is that we have something that is already instantiated within our culture, right? And I think there's divergent paths. We have something that's already instantiated in our culture and that has ingrained and demoralized and begun destabilizing, as Yuri Bezmenov, the ex-KGB agent who has that mirrored video on YouTube that you should watch
Oh,
if you haven't.
it's exploding right now. There's so many people referencing it. Yeah.
I found this
Yeah.
like 4 years ago, man, and I'm like, now you guys are watching this. But anyway, the point is you have demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and then normalization. And
so Dan, can you hold on a second? I'm going to stop the video. We're coming up on the hour, and then we can if you want we can keep going, and you can start on that. And you know, so this is.
I actually should have time to do more work tonight. I wanted to make sure I did the call with you because I really wanted to, and I'd like to talk again, for sure. Can I try to tie a bow real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So you have demoralization, destabilization, crisis, normalization. We are around the destabilization and demoralization phase, and you can see the edges of the crisis phase, like in the Scalise shooting, right? The demoralization stage takes about 15 years. That's a generation. But I think in a society like America that has a unique foundation in individual agency and things that really contradict that general Marxist narrative, I think and the size of America, the destabilization process demoralization process is taking longer. And which is why we see this confluence of where we are on this scale. And I want to tie the bow related to on all of this stuff, so I can try to delineate some between the text that you began reading at the beginning, because I think that I'm not delineating because I feel the need to. I'm delineating because I wholeheartedly believe that it is necessary to figure out how to delineate between the existence of an an acceptance of identity and resentful, contemptuous, uh, very, very kind of Islamist extremist degree of that kind of thing. You know, like the National Socialist kind of thing.
So you're saying you want to
I see.
you're saying that you're distinguishing between healthy self-esteem in this identity context and
Yes.
just an unhealthy outward projection of
Yeah.
your hate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Because self-esteem is not codependence. Self-esteem, to bring it back to those terms, self-esteem is not engaging in abuse in any directional way, you know, towards you or outwards, right? So self-esteem is what you want. And I think self-esteem is also centered within a cultural context in our country that is founded on the ideas of individual agency and responsibility, the ideas of inalienable rights and inalienable value. Have this, we don't have the self-esteem thing right now, and that is something that is already instantiated in our culture and has been, and that is what is creating the need for the relief valve, engineeringly speaking. And I think the only solution and the ethical solution, the solution that can stop the codependent relationships with other nations, the solution that can stop I mean, who knows if we're too far down the road, but codependent relationships with other nations is the idea of righting the imbalance that we currently have brings us away from a clear alignment with the founding principles of our country. I think that that is a fair place to start, because right now we don't have freedom of association. Right now we are not, that's the natural nationalism idea. The natural nationalism is the idea of looking at things we know about reality and looking at what we've gotten from the last 2,000 years of history that have objectively led to the highest quality of life the world has ever seen. And that's something we need to keep. We need to figure out how to integrate truths that are natural. And the self-esteem kind of centers in that. And I think that it's a process of articulating ideas in such a way that we can keep the pendulum from swinging too far, try to start minimizing the distance of the pendulum swing. And I think countering the neo-Marxist agenda in every single kind of way, one of those ways has to do with identity, and particularly the white identity topic. But it has to be figured out how to articulate it with an argument that supports those presuppositions, and I think that exists. That's what I'm thinking about.
Okay, so I think with that we're gonna break, and we can stick around after this. I really think this kind of is different from the last interview, where we focused entirely on police violence and Colin Kaepernick, and voila, I managed to shoehorn Colin Kaepernick into the interview. So we've covered everything today. Anyway, so Natural Nationalism is what Dan Casmir, he's at Daniel Casmir is his channel. I will post links below, provided this video does upload well. And, I'd be glad to have you again. And, we could discuss a few of the rabbit holes that we didn't get to this time.
Yeah, I would be happy to have a conversation on the air or off the air. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Okay. All right. Well, good night, everybody. Comments below. And if you want to be another guest on the Troll Tribune, then you can also contact me, Bold Like a Leopard. The contact information will also be below. Have a nice night, everybody.